Okay.
Three, two, one. All right. So introduce yourself to the folks at home. Tell people what exactly, who you are and what you do.
Okay. I do a little bit of everything, but the main thing in this discussion is obviously my relations with Thin Lizzy and Philip Lynott. Uh, I got to learn the guys back in 1976. I was doing I live in Sweden. And in Sweden, we have in the eighth grade in school this opportunity to take 2 weeks where we're going to go out and practice various sort of work. And it so happened that my arts teacher was the best friend of the promoter that was the promoter in Sweden at the time. And it so happened that the 2 weeks I was doing this trying out what it was like working for a promoter, Thin Lizzy came to town. They were gigging in Sweden, and uh, for some reason I hit it off with the guys. And I was only 15 years old or something. Robo was only a few years older than me at that time. So yeah, we kind of just stayed in contact, and whenever they came to Sweden, we just hang out. I traveled with them during the tours. I was in close contact with Philip up till the very last days of his life. Traveled with him on his final Swedish Scandinavian summer tour in the summer of '83. And over the years, Philip gave me material that he wanted me to listen to, songs that weren't completed, stuff that he was thinking about putting on the Lizzy albums or solo albums or doing anything, something else with. And I didn't think much about it at the time. But then when Philip passed away, to cut a long story short, Philip used to have this massive storage space behind his bedroom in his house in Kew Gardens in Richmond in London. Literally hundreds of tapes, multi-track tapes, two-track tapes, quarter-inch, half-inch tapes, with released stuff but alternate versions, unreleased songs, demos, anything. And those tapes after Philip passed were gone for quite some time. But without going into details, we were able to recover those tapes. So we're talking about hundreds of tapes. And I have custody of these tapes these days. And I am working closely and have worked closely with the band members and with Universal Audio, with Universal Record Company, and being kind of heavily involved in several of the Thin Lizzy releases over the last few years, particularly with the box set that came out last autumn. That actually we worked over 12 years on that project, not necessarily just on the audio material, but to get all the rights in place to be allowed to release the stuff. So, but having said that, that box set is now out, but there's so much more material that is not out there that we keep in the vaults.
So, how difficult is that process of securing the rights to those demos, especially with, let's say, Phil's solo demos? How do the rights work? Is it communication with the family? How is that all organized?
Well, it can vary actually. I mean, in most cases, it comes down to the estate, which is the state is Philip's ex-wife and his daughters. But it's also a discussion to have with Thin Lizzy Limited, which is a company that the Philip Lynott estate owns 50% of the shares of, and Brian Downey, the drummer of Lizzy, owns the other 50%. So he is also an instrumental part in what's going to happen with this material. But then comes the real tricky part, and that is when material has been recorded for, say, a radio station, or there's been other musicians involved in writing the tracks, because we have to find out this unreleased song, let's say song X, never released. We want to put it on something. And okay, how do we know Philip wrote this on his own? So we have to do everything we can, all precautions to make sure that this is uh, only Philip's, 100% of writing is Philip's. Then it's fairly easy. because then we have, we know whom to talk to and get their approvals and make sure that they are happy with whatever financial deal Universal is willing to give them. And that negotiations is between Universal and the estate and Brian Downey, obviously. But when you come to other things, like, I mean, Philip did a lot of songwriting with artists like Jimmy Bain, for instance. He used to be in Dio and Rainbow and so forth. And so there are plenty of demos in the vaults with them they're performing the demos together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they wrote the song together. They could have just recorded it together. Philip also did a number of demos with a guy called Junior Giscombe in the 80s, where he wanted to sort of create some music that was more in fashion, along the lines of what was in fashion at the time. They actually recorded one song, full production, with Tony Visconti as the producer, called Lady Loves to Dance. And that is a typical example. We have the half-inch master tapes of that song, both the 7-inch edit and the 12-inch edit. That's never been released. The proper version has never been in the wild. There's been some crappy copies of demos and things like that, but never a full quality, the real final mixes. But they are available there and might be released in the future if the stars aligns in regards to rights and the willingness of people involved.
Yeah, so how do the quote unquote like crappy quality versions, how do those end up leaking out? Like, how does that happen?
Well, to start with, the last years when Philip was in pretty bad shape, there were a lot of people hanging around in his house, and a lot of stuff was literally stolen from his house. And some of these people commercialized what they stole, and they made, at that time, I mean, people didn't have the capacity to create CDs, or, I mean, streaming wasn't something that was, didn't even exist at the time. So what they did was they copied cassettes, tape cassettes, and it became, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever generation. And a lot of the stuff you hear on YouTube today and other places are, more noise than an actual song or audio, and it can be quite painful at times to listen to it because the audio quality is so poor. But all these recordings do exist in their sort of master tape format. Just that some things the state decides this is not for human consumption. It's not going to be released because they have a certain criteria and a certain requirement that the quality should be high enough, not only from a songwriting perspective but also from a recording perspective and things like that. So that's also why it took a lot of time to create the box set, because we had to make sure that what went on there was really of high enough quality. And I personally mixed about 20 tracks on that box set from scratch, from the motor tracks, trying to, create something that sounded what they could have sounded like back in the days when they recorded the songs, so that they didn't sound like, okay, we found the motor track, let's make it, flashy 2021 type mix with all the effects and the, bells and whistles. Instead, try to recreate the sound from the era when that particular song was originally recorded.
Was there any thought of getting together like Brian Downey and Scott Gorham and taking Phil demos and making an entire album like they did with the song Dedication? Was there ever a thought of like using that unreleased material and like making a full album's worth of songs?
No, that has not been considered.
Never been considered, because there's just so
No.
many great songs that it's just that I hear the demos for, and then it's painful that I've only heard the crappy bootleg version. Like Gay Boys, I know that's a Grand Slam tune,
Yeah.
but that's one of the ones where I just think the writing is so strong, the performance is so strong, and it's such a tragedy that we only hear the version that's been leaked to the public.
Yeah, I think there's many reasons to why this hasn't been discussed, and also to why this will not happen. First thing is, you mentioned yourself that, Gay Boys is a typical example. It's actually a Grand Slam song, and to be fair, even Dedication was a Grand Slam song.
Mm-hmm.
So the guys in Lizzy really had nothing to do with that song. It was kind of created to have something to add to a greatest hits compilation that came out in the early 1990s. So they picked that song, and if I remember correctly, Lawrence Archer had a multitracks, and the record company bought a multitrack from Lawrence, uh, and that sadly turned into a legal feud afterwards because Lawrence was a co-writer of that song and didn't get credited to start with when the record was released. But I mean, eventually they cleared that out, and he's now credited as a co-writer of that song. And basically, all the Grand Slam songs were co-written by Lawrence Archer. So it really isn't Lizzy material. And I think that both Brian Downey and Scott Gorham, it would feel probably a bit sort of strange for them to re-record stuff that really wasn't material they worked on originally anyway.
No, that is totally fair. So you are in Sweden. What did you think of the new wave of Swedish sleaze scene that happened about like a decade and a half ago? Were you involved in that at all? Do you see any of those bands? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, what would you, uh, I mean, I'm also a songwriter and a producer, but I'm also the CEO of a company that is the exclusive distributor for Gibson Guitars in the Nordics, meaning Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland. And obviously, a lot of these guys are Gibson guitar users. So I've sort of through that part of my work have been in touch with them, and I think an awful lot of great stuff came out of that wave from Sweden. I think that has proven over and over again that it has had an impact on that sort of segment in the music industry globally. I mean, a lot of these bands were originators of certain certain areas of that segment. And it's actually quite still quite active. It's not the same, of course, due to COVID, but I'm sure that quite a lot of these bands are going to be reunited once we can all go back to live gigging and things like that.
So is that scene still, aside from COVID, still sort of thriving in Sweden? Because it made like a big splash over here, internet-wise, like 15 years ago, and
Yeah,
then sort of gradually petered out. But like, is that scene still going strong in person, minus COVID as the exception, obviously?
I would say so, and in quite a lot of other countries as well. I mean, it's still strong in Germany and still strong in the UK and quite a lot of countries. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, these guys have grown older as we all have, obviously, and so in many cases they have side projects that might be surprising to some. But I mean, some of them have opened up restaurants, or they are into fine wine making and things like that. So it could be anything. But I still feel that the music is still the thing that's closest to their hearts.
So, how would you describe what's your, as someone who has so much experience in the industry, what's your thoughts on the general state of the music industry today? And you can use the pre-COVID and post-COVID. Like, where do you think the industry is having? Do you have any general thoughts? Because you're a survivor. You've been in this through the long haul.
Yeah, I mean the streaming services are a curse and a blessing at the same time for the music industry. Obviously, it was a great way to get done with all the illegal sort of copying and all that stuff. Because basically, I mean, it isn't worthwhile to download stuff on Pirate Bay and places like that any longer because it's available on, iTunes or Spotify or Tidal or any of these services. And but what is kind of, with a few exceptions, but most of these services offers compressed audio, which means that the audio quality really isn't what it used to be on a properly recorded CD. That is a bit of a shame if you wanted to hear the music the way it was intended when it was mixed and produced. But at least it's legal. It gives the musicians some revenue streams, but that's the next problem, that the revenue stream that actually ends up with the musicians is far too small. I mean, the record companies take far too big a part of the pie, in my opinion, considering that they no longer do all the things a record company used to do. I mean, back in the days when we had CDs or vinyl or all that stuff, I mean, technically a record company had to deal with producing a physical product that they had to distribute physically to a number of record stores, that had to rent space, that had to make a margin, and there was so many parts in that chain that justify the price of a CD. But these days, the record companies are actually more profitable than they ever been, but they'd have such a small cost of distributing the music compared to what it used to be, and the share that the musicians are getting from these streams are minuscule. It's almost offensive at times when you hear how little people actually make on songs that's been played millions and millions and millions of times on Spotify or other services. So that could be something that will damage the music long term, in my opinion, because if we look at it like this, when I started out in this industry, bands typically lived off the profit of their record sales, and they toured to promote the album. Whereas today, let's disregard COVID for a minute here. But I mean, today it's more like you have to do a record to promote your tour.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of turned around. It's the tour that's supposedly going to make you money these days. And if you go on tour, you have to make sure that you have all the swag there to sell and make profit out of that. So it's for the band, for the musicians, it's so much more difficult to actually make a living out of the music. And I think that is something that could potentially risk the entire industry from losing a lot of talented artists because they can't afford to be artists any longer. So that's a major concern of mine.
Yeah, I mean that's basically one of the reasons I've mostly gotten out of the industry. I still do some gigs here and there. Like I did a film score last year. I think I don't know, the days are blending together, but did a film score recently. But the amount of money it takes to be a musician versus the amount you're getting back, like most people aren't even breaking even. It's losing money in the industry, and so like me, for Spotify, I get maybe like $30 a quarter my share.
Yeah.
It's like, and I'm independent, so obviously there's different metrics to hold to that of like a small independent band versus an established act, but still like $30 a quarter is like that's nothing. That
No, it's not. No, I mean that buys you basically nothing.
that's not enough to take
And
my wife out to eat and tip. It's
no,
like just a
exactly.
little bit
But
under
you still
that.
have to pay for the house and the kids and the car and the everything. So I think that unless the way the sort of revenue is being split up changes in the near future, I think there will be some severe repercussions for musicians and record companies, because if there aren't any musicians, what are the record companies going to live off? I mean, they can't live on their back catalogs forever.
What I would imagine would be the case, and this is just me guessing, I would say you'd get almost a complete industry collapse. It's like a house of cards that falls down. And what you're left with is mostly going to be like the gimmick, like YouTube musicians, like the people doing metal covers of Disney songs and stuff like that. And I think it's going to drastically like hurt the art of like new artists upcoming with like the creativity. I think that's going to be cut down severely. You might still have like a few mega pop acts, but otherwise I think the bottom is just going to completely fall out is what I'm guessing.
Yeah, and I think we do already see that to quite an extent, in the sense that, I mean, if you look at the classic rock bands or new rock bands, etc., etc. I mean, how many arena filling rock bands have shown up during the last 20 years? I mean, all the big bands that are touring are, I mean, they used to be big in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But after year 2000, there's very few new rock bands that actually are mega, that actually can fill entire stadiums. So that is concerning in the sense that, where is rock music going to go? And also with the Spotify thing and the streaming thing, that concerns me is that when I grew up, we bought albums and we listened to albums. We listened to artists. We got to learn the catalog of an artist, and there was a sort of a sustainability for a band that. I mean, most bands, if they made 3 albums and they became reasonably big, they would carry on recording more albums, and you follow them through their career, and that could well be 10 or 15 years. Whereas today, it's all about one-hit wonders. Some of them actually have a few hits, but I mean, the younger generation clearly doesn't listen and get that sort of impression you did get back in the day. And I probably sound like an old fart now, but the impression you got when you sat down with a full album, your headphones on, or a good speaker system, and really enjoyed listening to music. That doesn't happen any longer. I mean, the younger generation. I mean, my youngest son is 16 years of age, and I mean, he listens. I mean, he listens to music on his, you know, earpods on his way off, to and from school, in MP3 quality, or it's something that is going on in the background while he's playing computer games or something like that. It's not that, this younger generation doesn't get that opportunity to devote themselves to music listening. And I think it's sad in a sense, that music has sort of become more of a uh, commodity thing that just happens in your surroundings. It's not, it doesn't play the role it used to.
Well, I think there's a number of things to consider with that because we're living in the attention economy where everyone is just trying to get your attention, and so not only do you have music, basically every song you've ever loved, like essentially for free, or with your Spotify account or whatever, you can listen to it very easily legally. Plus, you have Netflix, Disney Plus, all the streaming services, YouTube, podcasts, audiobooks, and with a lot of people working remotely due to COVID, that's given them access to be like, I'm working on my computer. I want to multitask. Oh, I can put music on in the background. It becomes more of a background thing because of just the way that society and like our daily lives have shifted due to technologies. So,
Yeah.
and it does put music in this weird little box in that like if you're listening to, let's say, like podcasts or like audiobooks, you're listening for like informative content. You're wanting to download information into your brain to hear the other people talk and have sort of those deeper thoughts. But with music, it's more like that visceral emotional connection, and that more comes down to experience, like going out and doing things. And so that's like a disconnect that you're not going to have with music if you're just in your house. um, so it feels like that's sort of lost in a way. And also, like, in general, I found as a younger music listener myself, not younger any, I don't know, 31, if that's young, if that's not, I don't know
You're
anymore.
young. You're still a kid, mate.
All right, so still young by many metrics, but it's sort of it's a lost art. Most people don't appreciate the stuff that came before. It's all about whatever is available today. And with the short attention span economy, it's like you have to hook me into your song within the first 2 seconds because I've got a list of like 50 Netflix movies and all these other things I want to consume. So you have to like hook me immediately. And if the rest of your album isn't the exact same kind of thing as the thing that hooked me, it might not keep that person's attention span. There's a great quote, I forget who said it, but it's like the modern attention span is either 10 seconds or 3 hours, and there's like no in
Yeah,
between.
I totally agree with that. And that goes back to what I said earlier, that everything happens so rapidly these days. And when I was in my teens or early 20s, we had the time to listen to an entire album in peace and quiet. Where, the younger generations, they perceive, I mean, it's their perception that they don't have the time to do that because there are so many things going on at the same time. And that's also, another concern of that is that um, I'm worried about, are there going to be, enough young kids picking up, say, the guitar or the drums or whatever to learn to play musical instruments moving forwards? Because, as you said, I mean, people want this sort of instant gratification when they try something out. And to learn to play musical instruments, it doesn't happen, in 10 seconds or overnight. It takes months, years, a lifetime
Hmm.
and then you sit next to all these computer games and all these online activities that you get that immediate gratification straight away. So I mean, one of my things that I'm working hard with is to make sure that the younger generation still thinks that playing music is actually cool and it's worthwhile to spend some time on, because there's never been a situation where musical instruments have been so affordable and the quality has been so high as they are right now. So, in a sense, to play an instrument, I mean, when I grew up, it was fairly expensive to buy an electric guitar and an amp. But now you get stuff at fraction of what I paid back in the 70s, and the quality is like superb compared to what it was back then. But you still have to put in all that work to make it sound decent. And can we get that attention, or is everything sort of 10 seconds and too difficult? Move on. But we'll see, and the future will tell us.
Yeah, another thing I was just thinking of as you were saying that, another cultural shift that's happened is that in the 70s, at least in the United States, there was talk of like progressively like moving to a 4-day work week and Americans working less and having more leisure time. But at least in the United States, that went the opposite. And so like work hours went up and time for leisure went down significantly. And so like a lot of people, like people my age, they have to work like two jobs to stay afloat, and so they don't have the luxury of having 40 minutes to listen to an album unless they're like driving to work and like listening to music on the
Yeah,
way in. And so I think that's another thing that has potentially caused this, like as people are working more, having less time for leisure. I don't know if that's the same in Sweden, but you have people working longer hours. They don't have the time to just sit and listen to an album, or like they do, but they're choosing to watch that movie that's an hour and a half rather than listen to that 45-minute album when they're making that
yeah.
decision.
I think it's a global thing, if you ask me. And um, I mean, I can just, I mean, me myself. I mean, even though I have a studio, I could sit down there and listen to music properly at length. But the place where I listen to most music that isn't music I'm working on myself, it's, as you said, in the car. That's your listening room these days. And obviously you only listen as much as you can during while driving. And if I'm gonna drive for 10 minutes, I get 10 minutes of music. If I'm driving 5 minutes, I get 5 minutes worth of music. So yeah, that is true. um, but yeah, but at the same time, as you said, I mean, in America right now, a lot of people work more hours. They have to have two jobs or maybe three jobs at times, depending on what they are being paid. I think you do see that more in the US than in Europe, to be fair. But there is this tendency here as well that the people that I wouldn't say that people have to have two jobs, but the people that have jobs tend to get more. I mean, they are expected to work more hours, and then you have this big chunk of people who can't get a job, but then they are in a financial situation where they can't afford to maybe even pay a monthly fee for, or aren't allowed to pay for a subscription for some of these online services, because in Europe they check your credits before you are actually allowed to sign up.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
So it's companies are scared shitless about potentially losing money from someone who doesn't pay the monthly subscription fee or something. So same thing with a cell phone. If you want a cell phone, you have to apply to be approved for a subscription. And if you're being if they find out, and there are computer databases run by the governments that can tell the company that, okay, this guy hasn't paid his invoices on time on several occasions, so he isn't creditworthy, and then you're kind of locked out.
But to shift things in the more positive direction,
Yeah,
because we've been kind of Debbie Downers here for a little bit.
yeah, I
Um,
agree. Yeah,
if it wasn't for the power of the internet, I wouldn't have become the huge Thin Lizzy fan that I was, because I saw the music video for Dedication on YouTube when I was in high school. And that, because I had heard the boys are back in town and Jailbreak. I'm like, yeah, those are cool songs, but they didn't hook me in. They didn't grab me in. And then I saw the
Yeah,
dedication video, and I was like, I'm in. I'm
yeah,
100% in. Went, bought the CD. The next day I had to order it because no CD stores around me in the States had it, but ordered it online, got it. And so
yeah.
through the power of the internet, turned me into a big Thin Lizzy fan because they're not as big in the States. They're not as well respected
I
in the
know,
States.
I know. They're big everywhere else, but in the USA for some odd reason. Obviously, their tours. There were always issues with their tours, and they couldn't fulfill their tours, so they had to cancel the tours, etc., etc. And I think that's a big part to why they didn't make it really big in the Americas. But yeah, you're right. As I said earlier on, I mean, the internet is a curse and a blessing at the same time. And in what you just described is, of course, a blessing because everything is there for you. It's so easily accessible for you. If you find a lead to something that might sound interesting, and you can dig up all this information about the band or a musician or any artist, which is amazing. I mean, if someone would have told me that back in 1980s already, it would have been a yeah, right. But I mean, today it's what everyone does, and that's great. It's fantastic. Just something simple like if you had a discussion over over dinner or something, and you had to check some fact. When was this war ending back 300 years ago? And if you wanted to find this answer, you had to go. If you were lucky, you had a library at home. You could back and try to find some book, but now you just lift your cell phone and it takes you literally 3 seconds and you have the answer. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
Uh,
for the thirst for knowledge, for the people like myself who are just always into like learning new things, it's
yeah,
awesome, but it's also addictive because like I want to learn this, and like then you just like read and read and read, and you can get
yes,
sucked into the infinite wealth of knowledge that is the internet.
yeah. I can actually talk about how you got into this, your dedication. You had heard the boys are back in town, etc. I don't know if you can see this. Um, this is let's see if that's. Do you get any focus on this or?
Yeah, it's focusing a little bit. It's harder for me to see on my screen because I'm looking at the recording
Yeah,
screen, but
yeah, but I'll tell you, this is the original multi-track for most of the jailbreak tracks. So here's the 2-inch multi-track tape, the original tape. All the little cards you had while mixing. So you knew what was on each and one of the tracks, who was doing the solo, the list of what happened when in a song, so you were prepared when you were mixing. And the thing I was going to mention about this is that the first track actually the third track on this on the text, informational text that was written on the multi-track tape box, uh, says that the third song was a song called "The Kid Is Back," which is "The Boys Are Back in Town." So it wasn't called G.I. Joe or "The Boys Are Back in Town" to start with. It was called "The Kid Is Back." That was the working title of that song.
and that makes a lot of sense. That definitely feels like Phil's sensibilities, and I can see how that would be like the rough draft before it got to the boys are back in town. That definitely makes a lot of
Absolutely.
sense.
Yeah. And on the box set we did, you have alternate lyrics. So you can hear how he was playing around with the lyrics. And so verse 2 and 3 are completely different from what actually ended up on the final version. But yeah, so I mean, and that was just a side note. But yes, so for everyone that wants to get to know more about a band like Thin Lizzy, of course, that's great. And particularly, I mean, for me, this is close to my heart. Guys in the band are close to my heart. I mean, regular contact with all of them, and if that can help to spread the word in America, and obviously there's a lot of American artists that have been influenced by Thin Lizzy. I mean, most people probably know that Axl Rose has a black rose tattoo on his arm, and Guys in Metallica has one of the original Thin Lizzy mirror backdrop things in their rehearsal room that they bought. And obviously Huey Lewis, massive Lizzy fan, and a bunch of the sort of trash, sleaze, bands that are much heavier than Lizzy ever were. Start to scratch the surface and ask them about, who did you listen to when you were younger? Who influenced you? And surprisingly, many times Thin Lizzy comes up as an influence.
I think Lizzie was a band where, like, if you were a musician and you were serious about music and like were in that certain age group, pretty much everyone listened to them. Is what I've sort of
Yeah,
like come to realize. Like, I think Billy Corgan even covered a Thin Lizzy song.
yeah,
Like, the range of people who listened to them was really vast, and I think it's because you know the guitar nerds had that the great dual guitars and the different great guitar players in the band to latch on to.
yeah,
So you have that, but then the more thoughtful songwriters had Phil to latch on to as a lyricist, and so when you have those elements together, it makes it a really interesting melting pot where you can get your Iron Maidens and your Smashing Pumpkins both deriving influence from Lizzie in different ways.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do really hope that you get the opportunity to see the movie about Philip that actually had its premiere already last autumn in Sweden, but then COVID hit and
Yeah,
didn't have
I really
premieres
wanted to
across.
see it.
Yeah, it premiered in Ireland yesterday. Finally, they reopened the cinemas, so that's great. And I'm very proud that I was offered and did work very closely to the director of the film, Emma Reynolds. She's great, and that that was very interesting because there are so many new people that actually gets the opportunity to talk about Philip because the film is more about Philip than Listen, to be fair. But I mean, people who are talking for the first time, things that you haven't heard before, people that were close to Philip and can tell the story as they saw it from sort of the wings when it all folded down. And so I really hope you guys in the US get an opportunity to see it. I mean, it may not be in the cinemas, but ultimately it has to be available in some sort of streaming service or
Yeah,
something.
as soon as it's
You know,
available for streaming, I'm gonna check it out. Like that is pretty much a guarantee. I
yeah.
I was hoping to see it in the cinemas, but then COVID hit. The movie I did the film score, I didn't even get to go to the premiere to see my music on the big screen because of COVID. So I'm like, oh, this
Wow.
sucks. So
Ah,
it's
what a bummer.
yeah.
Yeah.
So if I'm not going to see my own movie, on the big screen, I missed out on the Thin Lizzy one too. Um,
Yeah.
so you've seen I guess a couple videos of my channel. How am I doing for a guy who's like not connected to the band at all? First of all,
Yeah.
I'm glad that I finally got contacted by someone official and that they didn't hate what I was doing, so that was nice.
Yeah. I think you're doing great. I think, I mean,
For a
uh,
Yankee, I'm doing
you,
fine.
you're a young guy. You picked up an awful lot of information, and I think you are making things very interesting. You do good analysis of the material, and me being the prick I am, I can't but comment at times about, well, didn't get the facts really right there. Hope you don't take
No,
offense.
no, I don't. And the thing
It's
is,
just,
because I'm doing it unscripted and I don't know what song I'm getting,
yeah,
that's sort of like my now it's like, hey, I'm not going to necessarily get the facts 100%. This is just
yeah,
how I feel about this song this day as it comes up to me, what I remember
yeah,
about it, and I think, and then people then correct me in the comments, and then that's good.
yeah,
But
yeah. But I mean, I think it's a great concept you have. You have a deep understanding of the band and the material. So I mean, I think it's great, and I think that thing about not knowing the song in advance that you're gonna sort of do your review about. It's kind of an interesting concept. I haven't really seen that before, and uh, that makes the whole thing so much more natural. So you can feel it comes from the heart.
oh well,
It's
thank
as you
you.
said, it's not scripted. It's something that it your feelings, your emotions coming out there and then, and I think there's too little of that these days.
Yeah, well, it started off because basically I got a headset and I'm like, oh, I should just do reactions for fun. And then the channel blew up, but then a bunch of stuff got blocked. But my Thin Lizzy videos did it. I'm like, you know what? Screw it. I'm just gonna do the Thin Lizzy videos. But I was at the time picking them, and I had friends who hosted a podcast where they had like a random song decided for them to analyze. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take that same concept of randomizing it and just seeing what I get week by week. Because when I was picking, it was like me trying to go between like deep cut, big hit, alternate. But now that it's out of my hands, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm getting. That adds a layer of fun
Yeah,
for me, where I can be like, oh, I'm really excited. Like, oh, I've listened to this song like twice and I'm not that into it. Let's see how I feel today.
yeah, yeah. Did you get the box set, by the way? Have you got a box set?
I have not because COVID was very hard on my family, so I have not. The
Ah, okay.
finances
I'm sorry to hear that.
crippled us. But you know, I have friends who have gotten it. They have shown me pictures, and they have made me jealous. Like Greg, check it out, I got the box set. But definitely want to. But it's you know, finances, the economy. That just it is what it is. I don't feel like any less of a Lizzie fan for not having gotten it. I know if I
Of
had the
course
extra
not.
income, I
No, no,
would.
no.
But
No, I mean, it's some people collect everything there is, and they would sell a leg and an arm to buy, that stuff. I'm not that type. I think it's more about, the music is out there anyway, and I'm sure you can hear a lot of those songs on YouTube anyway. I'm not sure it's available on Spotify in the US yet, but I'm
I
sure
don't
it will
believe
be.
it is. But I mean, it's definitely like it's on the list at some point, and I'm sure I'll
Yeah,
secure a copy at some point. But
yeah. The reason I was asking was that obviously once you get hold of it, uh, there's going to be quite a few more songs to put into the that sort of what's going to come up next from our review. It's there because there's a lot of song or alternate versions that haven't been around before, have never been circulated. So could be of interest for you, hopefully.
yeah, in general, at least for the show, I'm trying to go with the like canonical version of the song. So I'm
Yeah,
trying not because if I do like alternates and live versions, there's going to be bickering about which is the best live version of Johnny that you should react
true.
to. So
Yeah,
I'm generally doing studio unless there's like something really exceptional or the song is so different that it's like
yeah.
almost like a
You'll
different
find a lot
thing.
of that on the box set. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't been released at all before. And there are some versions of songs that are so dramatically different from what we all have learned to live and love with. That I'm sure, I mean, you're the judge of it, of course, but I'm sure you're going to find it interesting enough to probably put it into the kettle before you take the next one out of it.
Oh yeah, I mean I would definitely love to do that. The only trick is I don't know if those ones would get blocked on YouTube. So that's the trick is
Yeah,
I've been
yeah,
very lucky so far with nothing from the Lizzie things being blocked. So I don't
yeah,
know if just Universal is just being super chill about it and are just excited that someone is talking about Lizzie and promoting the product for free.
yeah.
So, but you know, I'm definitely like I have a friend who's like I've listened to a couple tracks from it and it sounds amazing. So it's definitely
Yeah.
I'm definitely a little bit jealous, but you know it is what it is.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure it'll be sorted. I'm sure it'll be sorted.
Oh yeah.
So yeah. So yeah. Apart from that, actually, as I said, I have literally hundreds and hundreds of tapes, but I brought two others with me. It's not exciting to look at a box
No,
with
it's
a tape
actually
in it
it's pretty exciting because I know that
because,
magic is
but this
contained on
is
it.
as we celebrated. What was it? 78. We celebrated. Oh, my math is terrible right now. We celebrated one of Phyllis's biggest releases done back in '78 only a few days ago, and these are um, the boxes include that actually holds the original master tapes for the Live and Dangerous album. But this is the first mix of the Live and Dangerous album, the one that didn't actually make it to the final vinyl version. So on the original mixes they came back with from Paris, it says here in the top studio just down the dome or something. I'm terrible at French, but they decided to change because of legal issues. there was this spoken intro instead of that immediate sort of bam that you hear on Jailbreak on the album. Uh, and they found out after they had done the mixes that they couldn't get the rights to use that spoken intro because it was taken from a screenplay. And
Ooh.
so they had to redo it. They had hoped that they would get sort of approval to use it, but they couldn't. And at the same time, they also then uh, changed some of the mixes as well. So, like on a song like "Still in Love with You," they actually did cut in an extra part on the version that went onto the vinyl on Scott's solo. So it's actually longer than it was at the real gig, and it's longer than it is on this original mix they did. And so bits and pieces that is when you get access to this material and you being a nerd like myself, uh, it gets almost anal at times when you sound, you're listening and find details and you figure out, that hey, this is not what it should sound like, or why did they do that? But I have to say, and I have to cover that area. We are all aware about Mr. Tony Visconti's claim that 75% of Live and Dangerous was overdubbed in the studio. Uh, I don't know if you know, but whenever Thin Lizzy recorded the gigs that actually ended up on Live and Dangerous, technically there were 6 gigs they took material from. There were 3 nights in Hammersmith Odeon in 1976 in November, and there were 2 gigs in Philadelphia in 77 and 1 gig in Toronto in 1977 as well. When they recorded these gigs on multitracks, they also always had a 2-track tape machine that recorded what came out, straight from the mixing console. So, and I have those tapes. So I can hear exactly what it sounded like when they did those live performances. And I can tell you that 5% at the most was fixed in the studio afterwards, which is fairly minimal compared to a lot of other albums that were released, live albums that were released at the same time. Basically, what they did was that there were a few bum notes from Scott on some of his solos. They cleaned up some of the backing vocals, and that's pretty much it. And why Tony Visconti claims that 75% was done in the studio, I have no idea. But I do know that when the album was released, he was talking about 25%. And as years goes by, the percentage he claims has been fixed in the studio tends to increase. So,
I think that's
yeah.
just hyperbole. Just always increases with age.
Yeah.
It happens to me too. I was like talking with a friend on another podcast recently, like, oh man, I've done 50 of those, and he's like, there's only 30, and like I'm guilty of it too. It just happens.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you brought that up because I was gonna be like, I feel like I'm obligated to ask, so I didn't even have to ask the question. Um,
No, because it's always there. It always pops up on all these listed forums, etc., etc. And there's always, in Europe, the Live and Dangerous album is still regarded by many people as one of the, if not the best live album of all times from a rock band. And whenever these sort of polls are being done or when it's being discussed in forums, there's always going to pop up these guys that says,
it's
well,
not really
it's not
live,
really a
man.
live album. It's like 75% done in the studio. And it's like, here we go again. And it's like, and the annoying thing is that I have proof, but I can't put the proof out there.
Right.
I'm not allowed to put the proof out there. And it's so frustrating to know that, no, it was pretty much live, it sounds the way they did sound back in the days because they were one hell of a live act. I wish that could be like in Back to the Future, an opportunity for someone like you to travel back then and see the act the way they sounded and performed, because that was mesmerizing. It was, they were on top of their game. And I'm pretty sure you heard the stories when they toured America with Queen. Queen obviously was the head act of that tour in 1977. But there were nights where Lizzy really played Queen off the stage, where so the impression by the audience was that Thin Lizzy was the band of that evening. And very few bands have been able to do that with Queen. And I mean, Queen, I mean, it's almost like a religious following these days when it comes to Queen. So I mean, they were, difficult. I mean, difficult act for anyone to compete with as a live act. And I think that's also, I mean, it's another thing that's true is that particularly in the beginning, or I mean, since Rob and Scott joined, that the early albums, the production wasn't great. So for me and for many others, the ultimate versions are the ones on Live and Dangerous because they are actually in many ways so much better than the studio versions because of the lack of energy, because of the production, etc., etc. So I'd say that for anyone in America who hasn't listened to Thin Lizzy yet and who wants to sort of get a grip on what it's all about, the first album they should probably listen to is Live and Dangerous because it is like the sort of best of Thin Lizzy up till that point. But the versions there's so much more energy in them than the studio versions, in my opinion.
I mean, that is a. I hear that from a lot of people. I am usually a studio version guy. That's just my general preference. But I mean, it's not that doesn't take away from my love of Live and Dangerous. But I tend to always go for the studio versions of songs, and and except for like certain times where I get the live itch. But that's just like my thing. But Live and Dangerous, I mean, that's a great gateway for Lizzy. I always suggest the Dedication album because, like, hey, if it worked for me, it might work for you too. So
Yeah,
that's another one I often suggest. But
I'm gonna I'm gonna move the camera so it's easier. I don't know if you can.
ooh, nice.
That's the actual gold album for the Dedication album. So it did fare well in Europe, sales wise, as you can see.
Yeah, I mean that's man, it has to be such a troll when you like know how good Lizzy is and how like Americans are just like boys are back in town and maybe they'll know Jailbreak and they only know the
Yeah,
Metallica version of Whiskey in the Jar. Like that
yeah,
is, there I feel like as you like go through life, like the number of comments you hear on repeat have to like get annoying where it's like Live and Dangerous isn't really live. Oh, they weren't really that good of players. Um
yeah,
and oh, they're just a one-hit wonder. Like those three things
yeah,
circling through the years. Like and people think they're being so original when they say those things. They're like, I'm the first
yeah.
person to think this.
Yes. And then you look at the reality. I mean, of course, I mean, I understand that a lot of people think that way in America because they never were huge there. But if you look at the people who were in the band that eventually moved on, like Robbo ended up in Motorhead, Gary Moore obviously became huge on his own. Still Got the Blues, I still think, is the most sold blues album of all times in America. And John Sykes obviously ending up with Whitesnake, and so I mean they're like sort of the equivalent of the Jarbirds of the '60s that had all these sort of super guitar players like Jeff Beck and these guys. I mean, Thin Lizzy were like that for the '70s and '80s. Philip had this sort of he had a nose for finding the young and upcoming guitar players and put them in the band and in the context and uh, when they left the band or when the band broke up, these guys, really made it big time after having been in Thin Lizzy. So apparently, it must have been a great school for these guitar players to be in Lizzy.
So, what do you think was the more important piece of the puzzle? Was the songwriting of Phil more important, or was the guitar playing more important? Which was, like, if you had to pick one, what is the thing that was the most important element?
I really don't think you could pick one or the other. I think it was the mix.
The
And I
marriage?
remember, yeah, I'd say so because I remember how the journalists kept referring to Lizzy back in the 70s, and they kept saying, that, well, Thin Lizzy is the intelligent man's version of hard rock, because it did give you the aggression of hard rock, it did give you the musicality of hard rock, but there were also the lyrics that really stood out, where other bands were just, tending to write the same old about, uh, love or breaking up or worshipping the devil or whatever. Philip songs, not always, but in many, many cases, were literally short novels almost.
Hmm.
You get to learn the story about, Valentino got a bookie shop, or, the boys are back, obviously, the story about when the gang gets back into town, what happens. And I mean, it's his lyrics were very, very clever, even though you might not say it's lyrics. But then again, I mean, Bob Dylan got a Nobel Prize for his lyrics, which is regarded as poetry. So he had a sort of edge on the lyrics, but it would have been nothing without the rest of the music in the band. And that's another thing that sometimes I feel that the other members of the band have sort of been downplayed a bit when it comes to the importance of the sound of Thin Lizzy, because I mean it's very, very obvious that without, any of the guitar players at the time, Thin Lizzy wouldn't have sounded the same. And particularly with this, Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham, when they came into a band, and Thin Lizzy started, they sounded completely different from that point onwards. And with the dual harmony guitars and all that stuff. Of course, there's been other bands prior to them that been, you know, having dual guitar harmony parts, but they didn't bring them to the front the way Thin Lizzy did, and make it sort of their signature in a sense. I mean, when you got a new Thin Lizzy album, you kind of you would have been disappointed if there hadn't been a number of those really cool harmony guitar parts in the songs that would, because it was Thin Lizzy, it was what it was supposed to sound like. Uh, but again, I mean, I think it's the mix, where you got all these ingredients, and I think it's. I mean, Philip actually did 2 solo albums. Um, that didn't become particularly successful commercially anywhere. Well, in Sweden it did, and in Scandinavian countries and on Ireland. But apart from that, it didn't. Neither of them did particularly well. So clearly, he needed that band in the mix to make his lyrics work as well.
I mean, that is a excellent answer, and I fully concede I probably give too much credit to Phil and not enough to the other guys. I still give them credit, but I acknowledge where my biases are. So
Yeah.
I want to ask you, we've talked a lot about Thin Lizzy, but like, what are some of your other like favorite acts, and maybe some well-known acts that maybe you're associated with that you've worked with? So like acts you enjoy
Oh
and
yeah.
other acts that people would be interested to know your relationship with.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of, I'm a songwriter and I'm a producer and an engineer. And I've been working in so many areas. Anything from, a guy that won the German version of Idol in the early 2000s. And I've been working quite a lot with Marco Mendoza. Of course, he's been in Thin Lizzy, so
Hmm.
I worked with him quite a bit. Um, I've been working with well, that's some artists again that aren't particularly well known in America. Uh, but I've been working with radio station jingles. I've been working on scores for films like you have, obviously. And well, there's a number of these artists, and I think you saw my resume on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
And so but my main thing has been it's one way or the other related to Thin Lizzy. I mean, I did work with, been working with Brian Robertson. I've been, had a good relation with Gary Moore, even though we never got as far as actually working on anything material wise. But and same thing with Darren Wharton, obviously, and yeah. Uh, I can't really say that I have. I'm not one of the sort of superstars that comes out of the Swedish songwriting generation that there are quite a few of right now. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but the guy that has there's only one guy that has written more number one Billboard number ones than Paul McCartney, and that's the Swedish guy Max Martin. And Sweden is actually the third biggest country in the world when it comes to music exports, even though there's only 11 million people living here.
So
Only,
would it be
only
the United States and
the
Korea,
UK, no,
UK?
the UK, and then Sweden. When it comes to actually making revenue from songwriting, and so we probably have about 20, 30 guys from Sweden that are uh, people that I mostly know that I've been working with that are, the guys that write all the music for anything from uh, Bon Jovi to Christina Aguilera or Britney Spears or Backstreet Boys or NSYNC or Celine Dion and all that stuff. So Sweden is a country where music is fairly important and it's very central in the society. And so a lot of people here are involved in the music industry.
Yeah,
Uh,
I love those like those songwriting monsters who just write like massive hits for like hundreds of artists. Like those guys, like like in the states we have like Desmond Child and Diane Warren, those
yeah,
types. Like I respect the hell out of their craft. I think what they do is awesome. Like I know a lot of rock musicians will be kind of snobbish and like, huh, they write for pop artists. I'm like, yeah, they write for pop artists and it's awesome. Get over it, bro.
yeah. But thing is that I mean, some of these rock artists also have some of these songwriters doing stuff for them. It's just that they don't talk about it much. I
Right.
mean, uh, if you take John Bon Jovi, wrote Bon Jovi for that. I mean, as an example, the song "It's My Life"
Mhm.
that was a pretty big hit for Bon Jovi. That was actually a co-write with Max Martin,
Yep.
who's been writing for Britney Spears and the guys. So so I mean, it's one thing what how they want to be seen themselves, but at the end of the day, they tend to work with these guys too because they know that it's a pretty good way to get exposure and get their stuff on the radio.
And I think the end result is something very good that the rock fans can still appreciate and the pop fans can get into the band that they might not have checked out before. What do you think about that? Like I feel like that the rock and pop divide and like rock and metal, it's like it's very divisive in like the United States, where like if you're like a hardcore rock guy or a hardcore metal guy, you're like, man, pop is trash, and you have to pretend that you don't like it. I feel like in Sweden there seems to be a bit more openness to different kinds of
I
music.
agree. I agree. I think that most people in Sweden listen to songs, not genres. It's more like if a song is a good song, then I listen to it. I don't care whether it's pop or if it's heavy metal or sleaze. If it's something that it's appealing to me, fine. And I think that's the way it should be. But I also think it's partly to do with age, because I think that the younger you are, the more sort of, I mean, you have more of an opinion when you're younger about, well, this is my style. I don't listen to that shit. But as you mature, you do get to realize that, you know, why is it I'm humming along to this song? I really shouldn't. I mean, it's not my sort of preference. But you find out that, well, maybe it is. It's just that I now can allow myself to accept it.
I'll say this: that I don't think that's necessarily the case here in the states. Unfortunately, the
Okay.
the rock and metal guys who are quite a bit older than me are still like, if it's not metal, I'm not listening to it. I'm like, but why? There's so much good stuff. Like
Yeah.
the Beatles aren't heavy enough for me. I'm like, yeah, but they're the Beatles. Like
Yeah.
you're
And there
not gonna
wouldn't
listen.
have been any of those bands that came afterwards without the Beatles.
Right,
I
but
mean, it's all history.
I know, but I pull my hair out, talking with them. Like, so
Yeah.
you won't listen to the Beatles because they're not heavy enough. That's your only reason. Like, but bro, Helter Skelter, come
Yeah.
on, man.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, to me, that's kind of a strange attitude to have. But then again, even if you look at America, and I mean, I know you live in Nashville, right?
Yes.
And where the center of country music, and I mean, if you listen to country music 20 years ago and listen to country music now, country music's more of rock music really today than what it was with, all the yodeling and stuff back 20 years ago. So I think, these genres are eventually going to blend, and they do influence each others. And as I was talking about all these Swedish songwriters that have been doing well in America and across the globe, I mean, these guys, pretty much all of them were in heavy metal bands in the 80s. That's where they came from. And now they're writing songs for pop artists. So clearly, uh, the pop music you hear today is heavily influenced by songwriters that have their roots in the 80s heavy metal from Sweden or other countries.
Well, yeah, because
So,
that music was all about vocal hooks, and pop
yeah,
music is about vocal hooks. So they just made it less heavy, but structurally, a lot of it is the same as like that hair metal stuff. It's still just like
yeah,
a very clean melody line that's easy for the listener to get attached to. Big sing along chorus. It's just they moved genres, but it's still the same craft of songwriting.
absolutely. Yeah. So, but I mean, and also, I mean, these guys that have this sort of hookup on, if it isn't heavy metal, I'm not going to listen to it. They're a loss.
Yeah, I mean that's how I look at it too, because I think you learn so much as a songwriter, and I know you can attest to this when you listen to like a well-crafted pop song, and there can be maybe there's only four chords in that song, but if they make that song a visceral experience as a listener, we're emotionally locked in, you're remembering every word, the melody sticks in your soul, even if there's only four chords, it makes you think, what a great production, how well produced is this track, how great are those vocal harmonies, how great are these subtleties, these dynamic shifts in the drums that make that noticeable difference, and make you realize when you need to scale back and like you're overcomplicating things, and like how pure something simple can be and how hard that can actually be to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's proof of that on the multi tracks from Thin Lizzy's, well, going through that pack material. Uh, they typically work like, they kind of almost always over arranged the songs on the multi track tape. And then when they mixed it, they cut out an awful lot of stuff just to clean it up and make it more accessible. Wise decisions every single time I've listened to it. I understand perfectly well why they did it. But it's so easy to fall into that trap that you just mentioned, that you try to overdo thing and make, you create this wall of sound and things going on all the time. So you lose all the dynamics. And when you lose the dynamics, you kind of makes it boring in a sense.
And things can clash very easily. So a
Yes.
guitar
Yeah.
part you might I this is something I say to almost every musician that I know. And the good ones are like, yes, obviously, and the more like snobby ones get annoyed with it, but it's play what's fun to listen to, not what's fun to play. And I think those can
Exactly.
be different. Those are very different things. Like you as a guitar player, I'm like, this is really challenging and difficult, but it tramples over the vocal. So you can't have
Yeah.
something that tramples over the vocal. It needs to work together. It needs to gel. It needs to be cohesive.
Yeah, absolutely. In a sense, it's like, being an instrumentalist, regardless of what if it's the guitar or it's a bass or drums or whatever. In a sense, it's like driving a car. I mean, you might have this muscle car that can drive 200 miles an hour, but if you have, pedal to the metal at all times, you know, not only is it going to be dangerous, you're going to lose like interest in it after a while.
Hmm.
It's the dynamics between going slow and fast and the acceleration up till you get the top speed that makes it exciting. And for an instrumentalist, it's like sometimes when I speak to musicians, it's like, okay, I realize you're a fantastic guitar player, you're technically brilliant, but 99% of your audience will not and cannot appreciate it. Because at the end of the day, when they leave the gig, it's the hooks, it's the choruses, it's the strength of the song they are gonna, bring back with them. And in that sense, I think, I mean, being a guitar, my main guitar, my instrument is guitar, and you know, of course, it would be great if I could play solo all over the place, but I realize it's boring for everyone else. So it's like, why jerk off with that? Instead, try to focus on creating something that is of interest to everyone. And if it's of interest to everyone, it's more rewarding for yourself, at the end of the day anyway. Because there's no point in creating something that, you don't get the feedback that you want to get, because you can't simply, control your urges to be all over the place. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Is the short answer.
And and that's not to say there isn't a place to go like that over the top. Like, to my what comes to head in my mind immediately is the Thunder and Lightning guitar solo, which is crazy and over the top, but it works in the context of it, and that makes it more exciting than if it was just the entire song. If he had if he was just shredding over the verses, it would get annoying. But in the context of that space, it makes it that much more visceral, exciting, and grabs you in as the listener. And I think that it's usually guitar players that I have this issue with.
It is, and with Thunder and Lightning, it's interesting you brought that one up because I to this very day, I quite often meet people who think that there are actually two guitar solos in that song. They don't realize that one of the solos is actually a keyboard part played
Yeah,
by Darren.
that I very much realize that's a keyboard part because it sounds like a keyboard, and I don't understand. But whatever. Not everyone has the trained ear, and I can say if you're a non-musician and you're hearing that, I could see how someone could think that's just like a guitar with a weird effect, because that is a
Yeah,
keyboard sound that is very much
it,
from that era that isn't really in vogue in any other era. It's like
exactly. Yeah,
late 70s, early 80s. You never hear that sound ever again in the history of music, pretty
no,
much.
but you'd be surprised how many people actually think that's a guitar. So they refer to well, the second solo on Thunder and Lightning, it's blah blah blah. It's like, hey, do you realize that's actually an Oberheim synthesizer? And it's like, wow, really? So yeah, again, but maybe we as nerds, we're too deep into the whole sort of creative part of music. So, and because most listeners, and all the respect for the average listener, because they are the main audience.
Hmm.
But I mean, uh, no offense to my wife, but sometimes when we discuss music and I tell her that's a really cool groove there on the bass guitar, and it's like, okay, what is the bass? So it's like, people not playing instruments don't, I mean, they just listen to the full picture. It's like, I guess that a painter, an artist, when they look at the painting, they look at the details, they look at, the technique that went into painting this picture. And whereas me, who's a complete idiot when it comes to those sort of things, I look at the picture. I look, what is my impression of the picture? And I think for musicians, we very often have the tendency of being that type of guy, when we listen to music as well. It's kind of, we dissect the parts of a song, and we kind of sometimes forget, listen, take that step back and listen to the full picture.
Yeah, I think that is. I think that's part of like the learning process because when you start off as a musician, you're looking at the artist you like and you're trying to figure out how they're doing what they're doing. So you're watching their movements, you're trying to figure out what's that technique that they're doing to get that sound from the guitar. What's this chord progression? Why does that sound so good? And then you start to learn your theory chops and stuff. But I think that a lot of people, my main focus when I started off was really on songcraft. Um,
Yeah,
because I had a piano. I had like the grand piano in my grandparents' house, but I didn't necessarily have a guitar, and I wanted to write songs. So, and I couldn't take that piano with me, so I could use it to like show songs to the rest of the band when they came over. But that meant I wasn't focused on playing them; I was focused on writing them, and
yeah,
that gave me that different emphasis of like what is important. Whereas a lot of people, when they start off, they're just focused on getting better at their one instrument and not worried so much about songcraft. But I think that, like, without songcraft, like, your band basically has nothing. Like, I think that is, like, you need great players, as mentioned with like Robbo and Scott and Brian Downey. Like they without those great players, Phil's songs would have fallen to the wayside. But also they needed
Yeah,
Phil's great songs, otherwise they'd be, because there's a million great players out there, but you need that
yeah,
great player, great song combination to make it to that next level.
absolutely. And another thing that I keep reminding people about quite regularly is the fact that when it comes to songwriting, sometimes it can be a hindrance to actually be too good of an instrumentalist because you're getting tied up in that. And if you think about it, if you think about the real virtuosos, how many of these guys have actually written proper, big hit songs? Very few, very, very few. The ones that are writing the sort of, really strong, super big hits are pretty average on their instruments because the technique and that thinking doesn't get in their way in the creative process. They don't make it too complicated. They make it accessible to the listener.
Yeah, I think, and that's something that like it's very hard to do because you can think you're being more clever than you are, and like you have to understand that like such a wide swath of people might hear your product, and like not getting there's a place for being self-indulgent, and there's a place for scaling back, and it is so hard to like keep that mental state, and that's why a producer is so important.
Yes, someone who can sort of have a fresh, non-biased perspective on things and really make the decisions. I agree with that. It's something I need to mention though in regards to the songwriting of Thin Lizzy, and sadly we've seen that being communicated in the open at times as well. I'm sure you heard about Lawrence Archer's, while he was at the Elizabeth Grand Slam, Lawrence Archer's sort of difficulties getting the songwriting credits he deserved because he did co-write those songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he's still struggling to get those credits. And for him, of course, that's a revenue stream that he's being denied. And there are a couple of these stories with Thin Lizzy as well. And I'd say that particularly Brian Robertson has not been given the full credit as a songwriter he should have, because he was young at the time and didn't realize the importance of having your name there on the record and having your publishing in place. So when it comes to a song like Emerald, for instance, Robo wrote all the music, but it was decided that it was going to be a four split. So when the album came out, it said, Lynette, Downey, Gorham, Robertson, even though Robo wrote the entire song. Cowboy Song was the same thing. He's not even credited. And this is, really weird one. Philip gave Brian Downey 50% of the credits as a birthday gift, which is really odd. And these songs are some of the absolutely most sort of, in the Lizzy community, the most liked songs in that catalog. And Robo doesn't get anything revenue-wise from songwriting of those songs. Well, he gets 25% from Emerald, of course, but from Cowboy Song he gets nothing, even though he wrote the song.
Yeah, that is wild, and I've where do you come in on like a songwriting dispute? Because I remember when we had one guitar player who was in the band with us and tried to take credit on every song that I brought to the band while he was in the band, but I wrote like out the guitars, the chords, the riffs, the lyrics, but it's like, well, I'm playing it differently than how you wrote it. But it's like if you invert a chord or play with a different phrasing, I don't consider that to be songwriting. I consider that to be
No,
like your own, you're giving it your own flair as a player, and
yeah, it's more to do with the arrangements,
right,
not actually songwriting.
that's more arrangement than songwriting. And so, do you think there's some instances? So, do you think in Robbo's case, it's definitely just the songwriting not being properly credited and not like arrangement? Like, don't believe a word. Where would that fit in? Is that arrangement or is that songwriting?
I think that this change was so dramatic in that sense. That wasn't a matter of just playing the chords slightly
Yeah,
differently or
because
anything.
that is a massive change. So like that one, I'd say
Yes.
that's songwriting versus you know mine. I had a Vinnie Vincent in the band, and that's just how it goes sometimes. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but Robbo, I think there's with Don't Believe a Word, Emerald, Cowboys. It sounds like he definitely needed credit on all those.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think for the open word, Downey should have credits as well because there's a story, background story to what happened. Philip came to the studio, and I actually have the original demo Philip did on his own, which isn't even close to the one Gary Moore recorded, a year later for his solo album. So it's not even the blues version. It's more like a singer-songwriter type of arrangement that he presented. Really slow. He was just strumming the guitar and singing on it. The lyrics wasn't really completed, but more or less. And the band just rejected the song, and Philip just got pissed and left the studio. They hired this rehearsal studio outside London, like 2 hour drive outside London, and so they had the rehearsals there. And Philip got so pissed, so he left and didn't come back for 2 days. And the other guys were there in that rehearsal studio, and Downey and Robert said, "Hey, we can't just sit around here. We have to do something. Why don't we try to come up, see what we can do with this song, and see if we can sort of turn it into something, interesting." And they came up with that sort of shuffle arrangement and up tempo sort of thing that was very, very, very different from what Philip had presented to them. And that ended up as "Don't Believe a Word," which is a fantastic little song. And in my opinion, I mean, both these guys should have had songwriting credits because hadn't they done that and changed that song so dramatically, that song wouldn't even have been considered to be a song on a Thin Lizzy album.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's now like one of the highlights of the entire catalog, and I think that is in my opinion, based upon what I know of the band, the best time that the rest of the band overrode Phil and said, "No, we have a better idea." Like
Yeah,
you, usually I am like Phil is guiding the ship, the captain, heading the right direction. But that is the best example of like everyone else being like, "No, you're full of shit. Here, let's do this instead." And like everyone else being right. For me, that's the
yeah,
best example in the catalog.
yeah, absolutely. But there were situations where Philip came with a demo. I mean, I have the Philip's home demo of "Waiting for an Alibi" as an example, and that is pretty much the way. I mean, apart from it being a crappy recording, obviously, because he
Right.
at that time he had his 4 track, say, reel to reel machine in his flat, and he played electric guitar straight into the tape recorder and distorted it by just overloading the signal, and it sounded crap. But the arrangement and the song was pretty much the way it ended up like on the Black Rose album. So there you have an example of actually Philip did the arrangement, presented something that was pretty much completed. So, I mean, it could be, in the case of Thin Lizzy, it could be anything from something so rough that the band really had to save it and make it into something that was, in many cases, a great song at the end of the day. But in other instances, Philip really had the full sort of thing ready for the band just to dig into and record.
Why did they cut the third verse from the album version of that? I understand for like single purposes, trim it for
Yeah.
radio, but like you had the real estate on the album. Why did they cut the third verse on the album version?
Because of the constraints of vinyl. You
Really? Because
couldn't
I
get.
thought they didn't have the space for another verse.
Well, the thing is that you have this when on vinyl, when you cut vinyl, you have this sort of the more time you put onto a vinyl record, uh, the more sound quality you lose
Right.
because and the needle is very delicate. So uh, it was a decision made to maintain the audio quality and not exceed the a certain time per side on the vinyl release. And since they were doing the single edit anyway, they just went for that single edit since it was there and it kept them in that sort of time constraint for the album. And to be honest, me personally, I think it's interesting with the third verse. but I think it's a much catchier song with only two verses.
I gotta go third verse version. If I mean the video is great, and so I'll watch that video all the time because that is maybe like the best music video performance of the band. But that third verse is for me like the narrative climax of the piece, and so like it's like the song "Bat Out of Hell," and then you cut out the motorcycle crash. It's like, but no,
Yeah,
that's
and
the I
it
I need that.
concludes the story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I really need it for that purpose, and
yeah,
also I think it's a the vocal is delivered so well. Like I need it personally, but
yeah,
whenever I'm watching the video, I'm like, oh man, I wish the third verse was here.
yeah. Well, it's the same thing with the boys are back. It had an additional verse as well, so they never used. So they did that with quite a few songs. They did cut them down to make them shorter and more sort of attractive for radio play. And you also have to remember that back in the 70s, it wasn't that common to uh, do a separate single mix or radio edit as we are used to today. It of course it did happen, but it wasn't like you know what everyone did. So I think they just made the decision that this is the version, and luckily I mean, the original full length version were still in the vault, so we actually got to hear it eventually, which is great, of course. And as you sort of kind of mentioned, and I added to, I mean, it included the story from a lyrical perspective as well. But that song, I mean, even though I did tell you that the original story was pretty much done, still they probably did about 5 or 6 different demos in the studio with the band before they ended up with the final version. And what you may or may not know is that the song was rehearsed and even performed live with Robbo before Gary joined the band.
I did not know that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And also S&M, they performed live with Robbo before Gary joined.
Did not know that
And
either. That is very
no,
that is
and
exclusive breaking on the show.
yeah, and this is the really big one because no one would expect this. I have video rehearsal footage of Philip, Scott, Robbo, and Brian Downey rehearsing Black Rose, the song.
Oh man,
So
it's good
it's
that I was
not
sitting down.
Gary. Gary didn't bring that song to the band. It was pretty much completed except for the speedy bits at the end.
Well, that is the worldview has been shaken.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that very few people know this in the Lizzy community, but that is a fact.
So
Uh,
you're like the guy with the treasure trove. Like you have all of it. You're like the master. You're Smaug with all the gold in the mountain. Like that's you.
well, I have some, but I mean, the state has an awful lot of tape as well. So Caroline Phillips' ex-wife, her husband Dave Tereskevich, he has a huge number of tapes that they're sitting on, and there's another collection of tapes that Philip's mother had in her house when she passed away. That's hopefully it's going to end up with either the estate or with the record company, but we don't know yet. We'll see. It's a very well known that Philomena had all the tapes that Philip had at Glencore in Howth on Ireland when he passed away. So there's quite a few titles on those tapes that are well, we haven't heard them. We only know that the titles are unknown to us. I have we did an inventory a few years ago of what she had, and yeah, that could be some really interesting stuff on there if we get access to those tapes. But that's not my jurisdiction. I'm not involved in those discussions. That's something that needs to be handled by whoever taking care of Philomena's estate, and to have that discussion with Philip's estate and the record company, and we'll see what what comes out of that, if anything.
Yeah, it's got to be interesting in your position in that like you were actually like this was your friend, someone you knew personally. And like how does it feel when you're like just discussing his music with someone like me who wasn't even born like when he died and just
Yeah.
fell in love with like the spirit of the art? Like where what kind of headspace does that put you in where you're like seeing this like this the cross generational like baton and spirit being passed?
Yeah. I think that's great, and I think that's a big reason to why I involve myself so much in it, to make sure that the torch is being carried on and that new generations get to hear the music. Because I think in many senses, and I think it's been proven over and over again, that a lot of this music that Philip and Thin Lizzy actually wrote and recorded is timeless. You can put on The Boys Are Back in Town today, and it still sounds fresh. It doesn't. Your first impression isn't that, oh, that sounds like an old song. uh, it's still, as I said before, my youngest son is 16, and he's more than happy to listen to that as well as the stuff, Machine Gun Kelly or whatever he's listening to in his AirPods. But the list of stuff goes well for him as well, And just the other day he came by and said, "Hey, at the prom here, they actually played Dancing in the Moonlight." It's kind of, Thin Lizzy is one of those bands that have the quality of going, moving on with the generations. It's not being, I mean, there's so many bands from that era that are just forgotten about. But Lizzy isn't, Philip isn't, and because it's quality, and quality will last. And as I said, I'm so happy to be involved in the projects I've been involved in, and I'm hoping to be involved in future projects as well, because you can't take that for granted. But for me, it's a matter of, Philip and the guys in the bands are my friends, and I want for them that, to do what I can to keep the music alive, the sort of, the legacy alive. Uh, and I think that it's also something that the audience is worth. I mean, they deserve to hear it as well. So I don't make any. I mean, financially, I don't make anything on what I'm doing. I'm doing it because they are my friends.
Well, that is extremely cool. Where do you think there's a way that there could be a Lizzie Renaissance in America? Like they could be like that band Death had that documentary about them and then they blew up, and Anvil had that doc and blew up. Do you think that maybe
Yeah,
this Lizzie doc could make that happen, or if there is a way? Because it feels like the story of Phil Lynott, like basically the only like half black, half Irish guy, living in Ireland, this poet, doing hard rock, like being like, an outsider and an insider, beloved by all. Like you'd think there'd be this way to like get that appeal to the masses. Do you think there's a way that'll happen?
I would love to say yes, but I have to say no. I think that the best opportunity that was up as a possibility a few years ago was when uh, Philomena actually had a deal with one of the big American movie companies to do a movie based on her book, like a screenplay, like the one about Freddie Mercury and Queen. I think that could possibly have done that. I very much doubt that a documentary. I mean, even though I think the documentary is great, Emer has done a fantastic job, but I doubt it will sort of give Lizzie the sort of recognition in the U.S. Uh, that they deserve but never got, and uh, I think it's too late. It's too many years ago now since they have been around, and of course, I mean, Scott has been touring the various incarnations of Thin Lizzy without Philip over and over again in the U.S., and they tend to be at the same size sort of arenas or venues when playing, and it's like playing. I mean, uh, it's too difficult to break through all the noise today to make
Yeah.
that happen, sadly.
Well, I would say my one way of hope is that if someone made like a killer biopic, like not as big of a budget as Bohemian Rhapsody, but like a level below that around Oscar season, I think that could be the way to get Lizzie to the next generation. Like make it a character piece about Phil, and just have it like well written, lots of poetry. I think that the audiences would eat that up, and it would maybe not make them massive, but you would get like a good, bigger cult following in the States, is what I would say would be the one, Hail Mary, bottom of the ninth
Yeah.
bat.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope that happens. But then you also have to get all the approvals from the stakeholders
Yep.
of the state and the band. And I mean, because there's always the risk of you ending up like the biopic on Jimi Hendrix, where the state refused them to use the original songs and recordings of Jimi Hendrix, and of course that fell flat to the ground. But we can hope and wish, and uh, I'm kind of a stubborn, bastard, so I'm probably going to do what I can to sort of push the idea, but I have very little say in that.
So what are you working on currently? Like, what's the current project?
Uh, I am not allowed to reveal that.
Okay. Well, fair enough. What's the
Yeah,
what's the last project you were allowed to reveal?
well, the box set was the big one,
Okay.
and the record, and we're also the record store day releases of Black Rose and of Chinatown. I don't know if you had those on the record store day in the US, but they were in Europe, and so they sold out fairly quickly, as most record store day releases are. The box set obviously did sell out really quick as well. It actually sold out even before it was shipped, just based on pre-orders on Amazon and places like that. So
That
it
has to be
was out
very
of stock.
gratifying.
Yeah, but we know it was out of stock for a couple of months, and then Universal eventually decided to print another run. So now it's available again since about 2 months back, at least in Europe and Japan. And for anyone who wants to buy the box set, I recommend them to buy it from Amazon Japan, because then you get the SHM version of it, which is the higher audio quality.
All right, well, there you go. You heard it here. And for those folks watching at home, if you want to give me like $200 on my Patreon to buy this, please give me $200 on my Patreon. um, but hey, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. This has been great. Like, one, I just love talking with cool people. And so, like, I'm glad to get to know you, but also, like, it's been a treasure trove of
Likewise.
information and cool stories. Do you have anything you want to promote? Any social media you want people to find you on? Promote, plug, tell people where they can find you if you want them to find you.
Nah, the only thing I want to say is, if you're a guitar player, buy Gibson.
Fair enough. Gibson's made here in Nashville, so yeah.
I know.
So
I
so
spent a lot of time pre-COVID. I spent a lot of time in Nashville, about 2-3 months a year, because I'm sort of in charge of Gibson here in the Nordics, and I've been a Gibson fan since the age of 12 when I bought my first Gibson guitar, and there's never been any other brand that's been of interest to me. So go Gibson.
All right, so Gibson Guitars is your official plug for the episode. I have to put the
Yes.
sponsored by now. Sponsored by Gibson and Universal Records.
Yeah,
All right. Well, that
sounds
is
great.
that is the show. Bye everyone.